Jacob pushed through the underbrush, his breath coming in quick bursts as Bernie's frantic barking guided him forward. The dog had never broken the routine like this, never bolted off leash into the dark unknown. Something was wrong, deeply wrong, and the ominous stillness of the forest only deepened Jacob's unease. There, Bernie stood rigid, his frame tense and his tail low. What Jacob saw next made the ground sway beneath him, the weight of unseen danger pressing in. But before we start our story, smash the like button, make sure to subscribe, and hit the notifications bell so you won't miss any new stories. Jacob was a middle-aged man living in a small cottage perched on the outskirts of a mountainous city. Though he had been raised amidst the chaos of a sprawling metropolis, the serene isolation of this small town had drawn him here a decade ago. For 10 years, Jacob had shared his secluded haven with Bernie, the scrappy dog he'd found trembling under the porch on the day he bought the house. The bond they forged was unbreakable, forged in silence and loyalty, a companionship as steadfast as the forest that surrounded them. Each day, Jacob spent his hours teaching mathematics to high school students in the town. The return home was a ritual he cherished, Bernie always waiting at the door, tail wagging, eager for their evening walk. It was a simple joy, grounding and familiar, a counterbalance to the day's demands. Their walks followed a familiar route, weaving through trails cloaked in towering pines and soft patches of golden light. As the world quieted around them, Jacob let his thoughts wander, the rhythm of Bernie's steps beside him a comforting constant. It was an ordinary evening, or so it seemed. Jacob pushed open the front door and was greeted by Bernie's wagging tail and eager eyes. "All right, boy, let's go," he said, clipping on the leash as Bernie danced around in excitement. With the faint scent of pine drifting through the air, they stepped into the cool embrace of the evening. The route took them along the edge of the forest, where wildflowers dotted the grassy border with vibrant yellows and purples. Jacob took a deep breath, savoring the crisp scent of pine mingling with the faint sweetness of the blooms. Bernie trotted ahead, his gait brisk and purposeful. Every so often he paused to sniff at the ground or paw at the soft earth, his instincts guiding him. Jacob let his thoughts drift, his footsteps in rhythm with the crunch of leaves underfoot. Everything felt as it should, peaceful, ordinary, undisturbed. But then Bernie froze. A low growl rumbled from his chest, pulling Jacob sharply from his reverie. The dog's ears were pricked, his eyes locked on the darkened edge of the forest. Jacob followed Bernie's gaze, squinting into the shadows. He saw nothing, just the faint outlines of trees swaying in the breeze. "Come on, Bernie," Jacob muttered, tugging gently on the leash, a flicker of unease prickling at his calm. But before he could lead them home, Bernie bolted. The leash ripped from Jacob's hands as the dog charged into the forest, his sudden force sending Jacob sprawling to the ground, heart pounding. "Bernie, stop!" Jacob shouted, scrambling to his feet, but the dog was already a blur of movement, vanishing into the thick undergrowth. The leash trailed behind him, catching on branches as he disappeared deeper into the forest. Jacob's heart raced. He stood frozen, torn between calling out again and the dread that whatever had caught Bernie's attention might be something he didn't want to confront. Every instinct urged him to turn back, but Bernie, loyal Bernie, was out there alone. Grabbing a stick for comfort, Jacob stepped cautiously into the forest. The once familiar trail now felt foreign, the silence heavy, broken only by Bernie's frantic barking. He pushed through shrubs and thickets, branches scratching his arms. The forest was denser than he had ever dared to venture. Suddenly, the barking stopped. The silence was suffocating. Jacob's pulse pounded as he followed faint paw prints. Reaching a small clearing, he halted. Bernie stood motionless, his gaze fixed on something ahead. Jacob followed his dog's sightline and saw it. A bear, massive and imposing, its dark fur rippled as it shifted, staring back at them. Jacob froze, mind racing. He had read about bears, how dangerous they were, but nothing prepared him for the fear gripping him now. Bernie didn't move. Jacob's body felt like lead, but when the bear stepped forward, He instinctively pulled Bernie's leash, placing himself between his dog and the beast. His breath was shallow. Running was futile. He braced himself, ready for the worst. Then, the bear did something unexpected. It stopped just short of him, raising a massive paw, gently touching his leg. Jacob's breath hitched. The touch wasn't aggressive, it was cautious. Bernie remained still, sensing the strangeness of the moment. The bear's gaze met Jacob's. There was no fury, no aggression, just something Jacob couldn't quite define. His fear wavered, replaced by curiosity. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Then, the bear turned its head toward the trees and looked back at Jacob, as if trying to communicate. It ambled a few steps, halted, then turned again, waiting. The gesture felt deliberate, like an invitation. Jacob's heart thundered. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but he couldn't move. The bear's eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, something changed. Then Jacob saw it. The bear's leg. A deep gash marred its hind leg, raw and bleeding. Its mouth was cut as if it had fought for its life. Fear shifted into something more complex. Pity. The bear wasn't stalking him, it was wounded. Jacob hesitated. Should he run while the bear was weak? Or was it seeking help? The sadness in its eyes quieted his terror. Shaking, he grabbed his phone. His fingers trembled as he typed a hurried message to a coworker. Something strange. A wounded bear led me deeper into the forest. If I don't check in soon, send help. He hit send and turned to Bernie. Go, Bernie, he said, kneeling to meet the dog's anxious eyes. Go to the police station. Get help. His voice cracked, but he forced himself to stay calm. Bernie hesitated, whining, but Jacob pointed firmly toward the path. Bernie barked once, then sprinted into the shadows, his loyalty outweighing his hesitation. Jacob watched until the dog disappeared, his chest tightening. Now, it was just him and the bear. The bear limped forward, glancing back with an urgency that Jacob couldn't ignore. Its movements were slow, deliberate, filled with pain. Defying survival instinct, Jacob followed. His pulse roared in his ears as they ventured deeper into the forest. Branches snagged his clothes, and the ground turned uneven. The fading light painted everything in gray, the towering trees forming an ominous canopy. The bear pressed on, exhaustion evident in its labored gait. Jacob couldn't ignore the absurdity. He was following a wild bear, guided only by its limping steps and pleading glances. Every logical thought told him to turn back, but he was already in too deep. The bear slowed as they reached a clearing, then stopped abruptly. Its massive head turned toward something hidden behind an ancient tree. Jacob inched closer, torn between fear and curiosity. To his surprise, a campsite lay in the clearing. A campfire and tent hinted at recent human activity. Relief and confusion warred in his mind. Who had been out here? And why? The tent was open as if abandoned in haste. Scattered gear, expensive equipment, and cameras littered the ground. Clothes and supplies lay in disarray as if someone had fled. Jacob's stomach twisted. Something had happened here. A low grunt behind him made him turn. The bear clawed the ground near the tent. Jacob hesitated, then stepped closer, brushing his hand against something buried beneath pine needles. A worn leather diary, embossed with a bear. It felt important. He flipped it open. The pages were filled with lively handwriting, detailing a traveler's journey through the forest. At first, the entries brimmed with awe. Then, they turned obsessive. The writer became fixated on bears, describing their strange behaviors with an unsettling mix of wonder and fear. He grew obsessed with a legendary white bear cub rumored to roam the deepest parts of the forest. The final entry buzzed with feverish excitement. The traveler had seen the cub, the myth in flesh. His words trembled with thrill. But as the pages continued, his intent darkened. Sketches of cages and notes on traps filled the diary, nets, sedatives, scent trails. It was all meticulously planned. The traveler's admiration had warped into a relentless hunt. Jacob's pulse pounded. This was no researcher. This was a poacher. His fingers froze on a page depicting a jagged rock formation, the centerpiece of the trap. The traveler planned to lure the cub there, ensnaring it in a pitfall. Jacob's hands clenched. The cub was in danger. It might already be too late. He threw the diary to the ground, scanning the darkening forest. No scent trails were visible. Desperation clawed at him. He turned to the bear, a wild hope surging in his chest. "You've got to help me," he murmured. "Can you lead me to the rock?" It was absurd, pleading with an animal, but he had no other choice. To his astonishment, the bear moved. Lowering its nose to the ground, it sniffed the earth, then the air. It paused, then walked forward, following a trail Jacob couldn't see. His heart pounded as he followed. The race against time had begun. Minutes stretched endlessly as the bear led him deeper into the woods. The bear halted, sniffing the air. Jacob scanned the ground, searching for traps. A sharp, metallic scent hit his nose. Bait. The traps were near. Carefully, Jacob prodded the ground before each step. Reaching the rock, his stomach twisted. A white bear cub lay curled in a cage at the bottom of a pitfall, its snowy fur stained with dirt and blood. Nearby, other bears were ensnared, some trapped in steel jaws, others caged. Their injuries were severe. Jacob's heart pounded with horror. Dropping to his knees, he tried prying open a trap, but it was tightly secured. His frustration mounted. A noise broke through the stillness. Voices, boots crunching leaves. Jacob froze. The traveler was coming, and he wasn't alone. Panicked, Jacob ducked into the bushes, but his foot slipped in the mud, landing with a loud squelch. The traveler's head snapped toward him. His eyes darkened, suspicion shifting to cold intent. He motioned to his team, their weapons aimed at Jacob. "Well, well," the traveler said, his voice dripping with menace. "Looks like we've got an unexpected guest." Jacob's body trembled. The traveler stepped forward. "You're not here by accident," he said. "So tell me, what exactly were you hoping to accomplish?" Jacob staggered to his feet, gripping the branch like a lifeline. "You can't keep hurting these animals," he shouted, his voice raw. The traveler sneered. "You're going to stop me with that?" gestured to the branch. "Pathetic. You've just signed your own death warrant." The traveler raised his weapon. His team closed in. Jacob braced himself. But before the traveler could fire, the forest erupted with noise, sirens blaring, lights flashing through the trees, and Bernie's frantic barks echoing like a battle cry. The traveler's composure broke, his eyes widening as the sound of approaching police vehicles engulfed the clearing. "Police!" a voice shouted, cutting through the tension. Chaos ensued as the traveler and his team spun around in panic. They tried to flee, abandoning their traps and equipment, but it was too late. Officers poured into the clearing, their commands swift and authoritative. Within moments, the traveler was wrestled to the ground, his weapon clattering away as he shouted curses into the night. His team didn't fare any better, their escape thwarted by the swift action of the forest patrol. Relief washed over Jacob as the danger finally lifted. As officers and forest patrol began dismantling the traps, the injured bears were carefully freed from their cages and snares. The white bear cub was carried out by a ranger, its small body fragile but alive. Nearby, the injured mother bear limped toward Jacob one last time. The bear paused, her massive frame lowering slightly as her eyes met Jacob's. In that moment, Jacob swore he saw gratitude, something profound and wordless, before she turned and hobbled back to join her cub and family in the trees ahead. Jacob watched, his chest tightening with emotion. By morning, the news had spread. Jacob's bravery, Bernie's loyalty, and the rescue of the bears became the talk of the town. As he walked Bernie through the bustling streets, a passerby called him a hero. Jacob simply smiled and replied, "I was just following the lead of a good friend."